Hey everyone, I'm about to edit two different stories. Both of these stories will appear with 31 stories for Halloween on Jay Wilburn's Patreon page. One story every day through the month of October. And some of those stories are brand new, some of them are older. Hey, welcome, man. But these two are actually a little bit older stories. They're not terribly long, so I thought I had time to do both. Also, both of these stories have been published in one form or another more than once, so I've edited them a few times. They could always use some improvement, but again, with older stories, I try my best not to completely strip them down. If Thanks for coming in, man. Um, so again, like one of my philosophies with editing an old story, unless I'm really trying to land a big anthology or something like that, is to careful as I be careful as I edit and as I go along, so that I don't take out whatever heart was there. Also, there's something kind of cool, especially when I'm just sharing it on Patreon, to kind of let the story retain some of the flaws that I had when I was writing at that time. So very likely I'll see a few of those and sort of fight the temptation to just completely rewrite the story. Before we get into that, I also want to mention that I'm going to do NaNoWriMo live on Twitch. So for however many days it takes me, I'm going to start a new novel and do the 50,000 words for it live. So as I write, I'll go through those kind of the same way I've done short stories, only for a novel. For that, I'll probably be doing a lot of planning the day before, so I'm not just sitting there staring at the page. A novel, especially one with some sci-fi elements, requires a little bit of outlining, I think, to keep from going too far astray. Of course, NaNoWriMo, any book that's produced at that time is going to require it's going to require editing and such. Oh, my computer really wants to talk to me today. So I may not finish it in November, and I'll definitely need to reread it, and definitely rewrite it as we go along if it's ever going to be published. But I thought it'd be fun to go through that process anyway. All right, the first story we're going to look at is called The Perfect Cut. This was originally written for just a blog for a particular publisher very early on in my career. Um, I had only written so many short stories that were not specifically zombie stories at that point, and so I was kind of venturing out into some other areas. So we'll read through it. It was written specifically for Halloween, which kind of makes it perfect for the 31 days. All right, The Perfect Cut by Jay Wilburn. Jamie drove the knife into the eye. He sliced it in a curve to carve out the iris. He drew the blade back out slowly to keep from slicing it out entirely. He held the face up with the blade still in his hand along the side. His eyes teared up and his lips screwed into a grimace. There was no point in starting on the mouth. There was a flat side on the curve of flesh that formed the eye. He had failed. He hurled it out of his grasp and let it smash against the wall of the garage that was becoming wet with his repeated failures. The hollow object both collapsed and exploded with the impact. He grabbed another and set it on the newspaper. Do it right or don't do it at all. Jamie looked behind him. He saw the tools in the shelves. He saw the diminishing pile of pumpkins. He did not see his father standing over him. He was alone. The voice had come from his own throat. It was his father's words, but he had said them since the man was dead, gone, and absent. All right, just an aside. Um, I I don't really use this gimmick much anymore. I did it a few times early on in my writing, and that's where you sort of do a switch on people. You describe it in a way that makes it sound like it's something else, like he's actually cutting on a person maybe, but then it turns out it's a pumpkin. The problem with this gimmick, it's kind of cool if people buy into it. But the problem with this, of course, is that if you're picturing the scene in your head and I'm describing it, if you actually were watching the scene and were there, you would see it was a pumpkin. So by pretending that it's not, you're kind of doing a little bit of a cheat that wouldn't work exactly the same way with visuals. So a lot of people, readers and publishers alike, kind of consider that an unfair trick. That thing I did where I'm talking about cutting an eye and not mentioning that it's a pumpkin right away. But I'm going to leave it in because it is what it is. Okay, Jamie looked on his pads and helmets by the door that led into the kitchen. He had missed practice for a second day, but this was important. He had to pick up more pumpkins. Don't cut too shallow or you can't fit your hand in. He set down the paring knife and picked up the long blade of the butcher knife. He stabbed straight down from above the pumpkin. He sliced in a sawing motion around the stem. He drew out the damp knife and lifted the scalp off the top, revealing the strings and seeds suspended in the space inside. Don't slice too wide or the skull will collapse once you carve out the face. If you screwed up, it is already too late. Don't be a baby. Clean out the head well, or it will rot faster. Jamie reached in and scooped out the pulp and seed with his bare hands. His sleeve was further mucked. Get it all, or it's a fire hazard from the candle. Jamie whimpered, but finished the job and lifted the paring knife. He closed his eyes and breathed deep and slow. He tilted the pumpkin back and went in for the next cut on the face. He went with plain triangle eyes to avoid the mistakes of complexity. He hooked the triangles out with the curved tip and gouged them out of the empty sockets. He went for the nose and cut an upside-down triangle. Really simple, baby Jamie. Wake me up if I pass out from boredom. Jamie went with a frown this time. He decided to point the teeth instead of squaring them off. He took the long journey around the lips. It took three tries to get the center of the mouth removed. He traced the lines with his eyes to be sure there were no flaws. It was plain. He considered eyebrows but decided against it. He thought about long slivers to represent stringy hair. The face is too plain, son. You're putting lipstick on a boring pig at this point. Congratulations on your flawless mediocrity. I'm going to take that ellipses out. I was really bad about just popping those in whenever I imagined a character pausing. No need to overdo those. He lifted the jack-o'-lantern over his head and drove it down into the concrete floor. It split along the back. He hoisted and slammed again. The knife slid. The knife didn't slide inside. The knife slid inside. The knife slid inside his palm, but he ignored it. On the third strike, the boring face crumbled in his hands. The acid from the pulp stung the long cut on his palm. He grabbed another and set it down on the soggy newspaper. His blood smeared across 3 ribs on the pumpkin. He snatched up the butcher knife and lifted it above his head in both hands. His breathing came in heaving gasps. He held the knife suspended as blood ran down the hilt. It ran over the edge to the point. A single red drop landed on top next to the stem. 2 more dripped next to it. Jamie plunged down into the top with a grunt. He took several breaths before he began slicing out the lid. How are you going to fail this time? What pumpkin patch are you going to buy out next? Jamie closed his eyes and cried as he lifted the top off the new pumpkin. You left us. You died and left me to make the jack-o'-lantern alone. So shut up and let me do it. Just shut up. Again, I'll take out the ellipsis there, I think. All right. Jamie bled slowly into the opening. He gritted his teeth and stuck his wounded hand into the pumpkin to clear out the guts. He hissed as the stinging pain traveled up his arm. He reached down and lifted the paring knife again. He stared at the bloody surface and considered where to cut next. All right, so that is the perfect cut. Not the perfect story. There are a lot of changes I could have made there. I think I used he too many times, but I'm gonna leave that as it is for now. Now we'll take a look at range. This one's a little bit different. As I recall, I submitted this one to some random contest on a web page that was about cross-genre work. The cross genres here include Western, I believe a little bit of steampunk, and then monsters as well, some horror. But again, I'm going from memory. It's been a while since I've looked at this one. So Range by J. Wilburn. The pilot spun the wheel in front of him using his gloved hands. He moved his goggles up on his forehead to look through the scope. You gotta have goggles if you're steampunking. The ranger pushed his 10-gallon hat up as he leaned over the pilot's shoulder. We need to cover some ground or there won't be much left to rescue. The pilot pulled his goggles back down without answering. He adjusted. It's amazing you can look at a story a couple times and still find where you made some basic mistakes. He adjusted the rudder of the Zeppelin with the foot pedal as they cleared the uneven top of the butte. Gus removed his hat and walked back to the trap door where Calvin triple-checked his harness. He looked up at Gus, and Gus wiped his mouth with his bandana. The other men walked away to take their positions around the cabin under the balloon. One walked back, slowly checking the line attached to the harness carefully through the pulleys between the gears. Calvin smiled. "You nervous, Gus?" Gus looked up at the brass ribs of the ceiling below the leather skin of the balloon. "It should be me. I've done this more than you." Calvin rested his boots on the crease of the trap door. "But now you are old and fragile." Gus ran his fingers along the rim of his hat. "He's my little brother. I promised our mother I'd watch out for him right before I killed her myself." Calvin took his grip on the handles at the edge of the chute. "Gus, that's exactly why you can't go yourself. You know that. Just watch for my signal. Don't pull me up early and don't pull me late. Watch my line." Gus opened his mouth to answer, but a spray of steam from the vents cut him off. He turned away from Calvin as the dirigible dipped its nose toward the hard-pan desert below them. The pilot shouted, "Spotted, reaching drop zone in 10. There are a couple hundred head. The target is on a spit of rock 15 feet off the ground." The balloon leveled out and hissed as steam pumped back into the bag from the engines. The pilot called, "Open chute." One of the men pulled the latch from the controls. Calvin kicked the trapdoor open with his heel into space. Wind roared under them, threatening to twist their craft. Gus turned back with eyes wide. "Calvin, please." Calvin nodded. "Drop." Calvin pulled and released. He heard and felt wind rip past his ears and through his hair. He heard the line whine behind him and then go silent as he flattened his body and hurtled toward the ground. His breath caught in his throat as he saw them surrounding the rock and writhing over the ground like ants. There had to be 800 or more. More were pouring into the valley through the canyon to the west. Calvin dropped out of the first rays of the rising sun behind the mountains into the cold darkness. He heard their growls building below him before his eyes adjusted to the change in the light. The line tightened and he began to slow. Calvin tilted his head down and extended his arms. He spotted Gus's brother clutching to the side of the stone. The boy's clothes were torn. That was a bad sign. He had slid down about 3 feet from the top of the rock. This would be tricky. Calvin drifted up toward the wrong side of the rock. He trusted the crew and remained stiff. He drifted back too far and fell toward the black claws and open mouths of the monsters. He was close enough to see the venom dripping from their fangs. Their eyes glowed red from the shadows as they stared up at Calvin. He adjusted back into position. Calvin whistled. Gus's brother and all the vampires looked up. The boy let go of the rock and began to fall. Calvin shouted, "No." I should put an exclamation point if he's shouting no, right? All right. Let's amp this up with an exclamation point. All right. Calvin shouted no. Didn't just say it matter-of-factly. One of Calvin's gloves connected with the boy's cheek. That's a cheek that belongs to the boy. The boy's cheek making him grunt. Calvin recovered and got the boy's arm and belt. He saw the claws and fangs reaching. Calvin waved his boot and they lifted into the air away from the angry screams of the undead. Calvin felt the hands draw them back into the belly of the ship. The trap door clapped closed. Gus wrapped a chain around the boy's throat and pulled him out of Calvin's arms to his back on the deck. The other men surrounded Gus's brother. Gus stood and took a mallet and hammer from one of the men. Gus whispered. I need to put a comma there. I was still figuring out dialogue tags. That's how long ago this was. Gus whispered, "I'll do it." His brother wailed, "I ain't bit, Gus. I ain't, I swear." Gus stood over him, ready, and ordered, "Be still, boy." The other men pulled at the boy's clothes. They checked his neck and arms. He pushed them away and took the chain off his neck. He stood up and held his hands out by the window. The sunlight washed over his arm, his face, and then his chest. He turned back toward his brother. "Are you satisfied? I led them out here on purpose." Gus dropped the wooden stake by his side. "Why?" Calvin opened a window on the other side. "I think I know." They walked over and looked. The vampire herd mobbed back toward the canyon. They bottlenecked as the sunlight swept down the stone walls. Their screams carried above the sound of the engines as they burst into flames and exploded in a firestorm below. Gus looked at his brother. "How'd you know it would work?" "Hunger makes them stupid, Gus. I just had to trail them past their escape range." Calvin looked up. "How'd you know we'd make it in time?" The boy smiled. "Gus always does what Mama tells him." I need to capitalize Mama because that's a title in place of her name. Gus hit his brother with his hat as the Zeppelin took a wide turn around the burning valley. Gus muttered, "Don't try it again." Calvin shook his head. "Sure beats killing them one at a time." All right. So even I forgot it was vampires. In my mind, I thought it was zombies, and that was the reveal. But it turned out the reveal was vampires, and I kind of played it like it was going to be zombies. So I like that story. I think that one's pretty good, especially for a flash fiction under 1,000. So that is the editing for today. I knew that those would be brief, so I figured I could get 2 done. And that'll be 2 days of 31 stories for Halloween. Appreciate you guys dropping in to watch along with this. It's nice to have some viewers and such stop by to say hi. And the next stream I do tomorrow will be for the podcast. So I don't believe I have an interview set up. I think it's just going to be me talking, but that'll be the next thing. So thanks for coming, guys.